Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, July 8th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible week after week. Remember, we subscribe to that good old PBS NPR model where individuals just like you pledge your support, and that sort of offsets the cost for those who can't afford to support the show. I have made a pledge that as long as I can afford to do so, both in terms of time and finances, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. And so I do want to thank the top patrons this week. You really, you just carry so much. It's so kind and so generous of you to ensure that individuals have access to the knowledge that is shared on the show, to the interesting ideas and insights, through the kindness of your heart and the generosity of your wallet. And so if you are interested in pledging your support, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Anu Bharavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. If you would like to hear your name called at the top of the show, just again, visit patreon.com/talknerdy, where you can learn about the different tiers and pledges and sort of what comes along with them. All right, let's get into it. So this week I had the opportunity to chat with Brandon Keim. He is a science journalist with a special interest in nature and animals. He is a contributing editor at Nautilus magazine, and he's written for all sorts of outlets that you know and love, like the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Guardian, National Geographic, the Boston Globe, and others. He has one previous book called The Eye of the Sandpiper, Stories of a Living World, and he has a new book out. It's actually going to be out, I want to say on July 16th. It's almost in your mailbox. Yes, July 16th, which means that as of right now, it's already in pre-order. You can go anywhere that you buy books and grab yourself a copy so that you'll get it first thing. Sometimes they even deliver them early. The book is called Meet the Neighbors: Animal Minds and Life in a More Than Human World. So without any further ado, here he is, Brandon Keim. Well, Brandon, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Cara. Thank you.
So we are going to be talking about your newest book, Meet the Neighbors: Animal Minds and Life in a More Than Human World. But we'll also be talking about you, your work, your interests, maybe even a bit on your previous book. So your last book was called The Eye of the Sandpiper, Stories of a Living World. When did that book come out?
That came out in 2017.
Oh, wow. Okay. So that was a pre-COVID project.
I know. It's crazy
There's
how
the before and the after.
The number 2017 sounds really recent to me, but then I'm like, oh my God, that's 7 years ago.
Yeah. Uh-huh. And so you're a writer, you're a science journalist, a nature, journalist, and you've been focusing on sort of the animal world for quite some time. So I'm curious, number one, how you got into writing. Like, did you follow the J school path? Did you follow the science path? Did you kind of come to it on your own, completely separate from academia? Like, what got you started in this lovely and complex world that is science writing?
Well, I think if we're going to go back really far in time, I've just always loved describing the world, and I actually can remember must have been like around like 4 or 5 years old, kind of actively in a third person describing my settings, like in like a bedroom that I had when I was, like basically a toddler. So like at some point, like there was always that impulse to kind of transmute the world into a narrative to describe it. But that took the form of just being a teenager who liked to write a lot. And then later coming out of college, it's I was doing graphic design. I wasn't really thinking of writing in any serious way, but I just kind of started writing for local alt weeklies, kind of like angry social justice stuff. And then I ended up eventually at a little nonprofit called the Council for Responsible Genetics, which doesn't exist anymore. But if any of your listeners want to step into a time machine for a moment, there were actually this really interesting group that emerged out of this controversy that took place in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the late 1970s, when there was a big argument about whether to put a new MIT, I think it was an MIT Harvard laboratory, sort of right in the city where scientists were going to be doing what was, then very new recombinant genetic, or, genetic recombination. They're going to be doing early genetic engineering at that lab at a time when everything was still, really, really new and a bit scary. There were a group of scientists. So there were the scientists who wanted to put the lab in there, and they were just like, trust us, it's fine. And then there was this other group of scientists who
Right, like
said,
we'll be
no,
the ones who figure out what's okay. Yeah,
exactly. And
like come
then,
on.
yeah, and then there was these other ones, and Stephen Jay Gould was among them, and Richard Lewontin. Some people who are very well known now. A woman named Ruth Hubbard, who was really the mother of looking at biotechnology through a feminist lens. These very, really brilliant, committed people who just said, no, this is something the community should have a voice. There should be a conversation about this. And so ultimately, there was a conversation about it, and what emerged out of that were regulations and processes by which the public had a voice in the science that was being done in and around their communities, which which is great at so many levels, including that it actually, people have argued, is part of the reason why Cambridge kind of became the biotech center of the world. It's not only because you have all these brilliant people coming out of MIT and Harvard and what have you, but also because you have a really stable, progressive regulatory environment where people have a say, and that's actually really good for business too. So anyways, the
And this
Council
was
for
pretty
Responsible.
new. This was a new idea, right, at the time. And the reason I ask is because I recently watched a PBS documentary called Poisoned Ground, which is about like the first fight for the EPA to like declare something a Superfund site. And it followed these like women, right? These women who were homemakers who were living near basically just toxic sludge, and did all of this investigation on their own, discovered that the factory nearby was like poisoning their children, worked really hard to get the government to like notice and do something about it. And this was only, I think, in like the 60s.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
So you
Like,
think
it's
about the
not
fact
long
that like
ago.
people being involved. Yeah, it wasn't that long ago that like regular everyday citizens were trying to sort of break down, and I mean obviously they're still continuing to do it, but to break down that wall, that really thick division between
Mhm.
like science and the people who the science ultimately affects.
Totally. And just like, this is this is me just taking this moment to make a bit of a pet peeve point, but like, we're at this moment, I think, where there's so much pressure from the center and from the right, and even from the left a little bit, to kind of reform our regulatory state and review all these regulations that we have on the books, and make things simpler and take some of them off. And I think in many ways that's a good thing. But it's easy to forget where the need for these regulations came out of, and just kind of why they're there in the first place. And I worry that we're just going to throw the door wide open again to the polluters and the people who say just trust us. And yeah, I really hope that doesn't happen.
Totally. I am not mad if large multinational conglomerate corporations have to dig through red tape. Like it's
Uh-huh.
a good thing for there to be for there to
Right,
be regulations to, like keep people from being poisoned by their products.
right.
Um,
Oh God, yes.
and that's the thing too that I think is such an important, like these stories can very easily vilify, scientists and like perpetuate this idea of the mad scientist who's like out to get you. But often what we're talking about is not necessarily what happens in the lab, but how that then is sort of released into practice.
Hmm.
Um, But anyway, I digress. We
100.
digress. So you started working for this.
Okay.
Was this your first writing job? Was this organization?
Yeah, it was my first real writing job, and I mean, it was like one of those times where they're like, "You know how to use a computer? You can be our communications director." And but so I was working for them, but I did get a little bit frustrated with advocacy in the sense that we would always just be really looking at one side of the equation and kind of avoiding the other, and from that, so I went into journalism from that, and at the time I wasn't even yet thinking of specializing in any particular type of journalism, but over time the beauty of science journalism is that you can really write about anything, and science is just the lens through which you do it. And I was and still am really interested in everything. But over time in my career, and really especially after my dad passed away, I think that was part of it too. I just started to concentrate on the things that I loved most, and that's really nature and animals.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, just kind of it's funny. I mean, I, I don't want to take literally every episode in this direction because I'm sure my listeners are getting annoyed with me. But I know that you and I had to reschedule today because of my work schedule. So they know that I've gone. I went back to school recently. I finally finished my PhD. I'm now doing my fellowship in clinical psychology at a local hospital here. But I specialize in like cancer. I do some work with cardiomyopathy patients. I really enjoy working with end of life patients, and so I'm always thinking about mortality and about sort of the existential things that come along with mortality. But what a beautiful example of something that like a theme that often comes up for me in my work, which is this sharpening of priorities when
Hmm.
we are faced with loss or with our own mortality, and realizing that we don't have all the time. When we're young, we think we're immortal, but we
Hmm.
don't have all the time in the world. And, our lives are this algorithm of joy to suffering. And why do we not, I don't know, try to maximize joy?
I think if I knew the answer to that question, or you did, we would be incredibly wise people. Um,
We'd be doing a
yeah.
different podcast for sure. I agree. And I'm curious then, you're often diving into these really rich and complex lives of these different species, large to small, kind of terrestrial to aquatic, like, all the different ways that you can investigate and grapple with how animals live. And I think oftentimes because as a human animal, we are obsessed with categories. We are obsessed with constructs. We love to divide. We love to split and lump and, say, how is this the same? How is this different? How can I put it in a bucket? One of the things that I've noticed, and I don't know if this is a good jumping off point for your book, but I think it might open something up here, is this tendency historically for scientists and psychologists like myself, who are also scientists, to when observing the natural world, when describing behavior of non-human animals, to be weirdly cautious, like almost comically cautious about not anthropomorphizing them.
Hmm.
Like, well,
Yeah.
it's not a person, so we don't wanna say that. We have to be really careful about saying that. And I'm curious how you, in your career, have grappled with that distinction between, what is intelligence? What is cognition? What are feelings?
Hmm.
Animals can't tell us what they're thinking or feeling, but why have we long made a distinction that, like, humans have magic in their brains that animals don't have?
That is such an interesting question, and it's a really profound question, and it's in many ways at the heart of Meet the Neighbors. And so when I went into journalism and then into science journalism, I wrote a lot about animal intelligence, and kind of I was approaching the subject through the lens of science and through a particular narrative of science that I think has prevailed for a long time and to some extent still does, where there's this kind of this history or this sense that, once upon a time we thought that animals were unintelligent, and now, thanks to science, we're coming to realize that they're far more intelligent than we had thought. And I think if we had been having this conversation 15 years ago, then, I kind of would have said something like that. But, there's a few ways in which that, kind of neat, simple pat trajectory falls apart. And so one of them is because, and I don't think there's any other field of knowledge that quite works this way, where we have, like, every single one of us has everyday, firsthand, common sense experience with other animals, and, can see that they're intelligent, which we recognize when it comes to our dogs or our cats, our companion animals. Um, and this isn't a new thing. You can, this has been at least the case for a century um, in the Western world with the rise of pets, and certainly going far back beyond that with just, interactions with animals, and of course, not to reduce indigenous bodies of knowledge to some monolith, but pretty much every indigenous ontology I am aware of has seen other animals as intelligent persons of a sort. So there has been this sense of animals as intelligent creatures, that is at once very widespread, and yet you know, for the last couple thousand years, it has been sort of pushed to the edge of what is considered, formal, real knowledge. And so we had this, and then especially, for the last 120 years or so, that it has really been excluded from serious institutional knowledge. And the history of this is something I get into, kind of about a third of the way through the book, because it really sets up the rest. And, for the basically, going back to the ancient Greeks, at this point, there's these, sort of very well known um, signposts of Aristotle's great chain of being, up through the Christian theologians who were just really bent on establishing humans as a separate category from the rest of the world. And so they kind of took that great chain of being, which basically said that, the animal world is a hierarchy with humans on top and everything else down below, and us is unique. And the Christian theologians took that and put kind of a Christian gloss on it. And then there's those, the Enlightenment thinkers like Rene Descartes, most famously, although he's far from the only one, who portrayed animals as automatons. And and all through this time, there's actually so many other thinkers who have been pushing back against that and saying, no, there's and other animals are intelligent in, very meaningful ways, and we also have these ethical obligations to them as a result of that. But they kind of lost out, and this is actually what makes Charles Darwin so extraordinary. And I think something that doesn't come through with our understanding of evolution, even among people who are very much, about science and about evolution, is that Darwin wasn't just putting human bodies on a continuum with the rest of the animal world. He was putting our minds on a continuum with other animals as well. And and there was this, very interesting cultural moment that happened in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where, within the scientific world, there was a pushback against, quote unquote, anthropomorphized thinking about animal intelligence. And often that pushback is understood as, well, there were scientists like, I think it was George Romanes, Darwin's protege, and the example of Clever Hans is another famous one where people
Right.
were far too
Yeah.
credulous about claims of animal intelligence. And
Yeah, and almost exploiting. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
But there's a really interesting critique of that, which just says, actually, no, those scientists were still being pretty rigorous, but there was this big rise of like supernatural thinking in society at large at the time, and just spiritual mediums and like all kinds of like super, very very wooey stuff that was being passed off as science in human contexts. And so there was a backlash against that, very understandably and very justifiably. But kind of animals got caught up in it because just scientists at the time just didn't want to be thought of as being so careless. So, and then in popular culture, like again around the turn of the 20th century, um, there is this episode. It's called now the Nature Fakers controversy, and like almost nobody has heard of it. And I would actually argue that it's one of like the foundational moments in how people have come to think about wild animals, where you had society was urbanizing, and you had all of these best-selling naturalists who were writing about animals, through the lens of through a lens of kinship, really, of seeing other animals as intelligent and persons of a sort, and President Theodore Roosevelt and kind of other very prominent science-minded natural historians pushed back against this, and really saw it as an affront to science, an affront to masculinity, an affront to kind of how they thought people should relate to nature. And it was like front page stuff, right? There was like front page New York Times stories, and like President Roosevelt is taking time out from his duties as a president to write long essays about these scurrilous nature fakers, as he called them. And that side won, and I think what grew out of that were the wildlife, yeah, like sort of our ways of thinking about nature, the wildlife management agencies who deal with nature on, a state by state basis, and the conservation movement too. They really grew up without any sense of other animals as intelligent, as fellow persons. And I argue that, now circa 2024, the science has really made it unavoidable to recognize that pretty much every other vertebrate out there, and a great many invertebrates, are self-aware, and that they are conscious beings with interesting things going on in their head and relations in the world. And that's no longer anthropomorphism. That's what the science kind of makes it impossible to avoid. And when it comes to animals who are used for food or for labor or for research, these that awareness of who they are has at least got people talking and thinking about how we use them and the relationships that we have with them. And those conversations are uneven, and maybe all the changes that many people would like to see in the world haven't happened, but people are thinking about it, right? But when it comes to nature and how we think about wild
Yeah.
animals, those
Mhm.
conversations have kind of been slower to happen. And so that's what Meet the Neighbors is trying to do, and say, all right, like what does it mean for how we think about the wild world, to appreciate that every animal out there, is a someone. And that, so it's both a science book and also a, all right, so what do we do with this science book?
And it's interesting because I think obviously we're just kind of setting this up, but this story that you've told about these historical and moving into the present perspectives, it it's not to minimize or to undermine or to throw the baby out with the bathwater, these important and incredibly profound movements towards wildlife conservation or towards wildlife management, but the lens through which like you mentioned, that these agencies were sort of developed at the beginning, it's a double-edged sword, right? Like, you think about Roosevelt and you think about this the the incredible work to preserve, quote unquote, or at least identify these wild expanses and say, we're not going to develop here, we're not going to drill here, we're not going to dig here, but also we want to be able to hunt here, right? We want to be, and that's not to minimize the importance of hunting. It's to basically shine a light on the fact that there was always this sort of masculine dominion component of it, right? Like we want to preserve things so that we can have access to them. We want to make them like quote unquote in their natural state so then we can use them for people in its most beautiful beauty. It's like a weird paradox.
It's yeah, totally. It's and there's so many dimensions to it, and I think hunting is another conversation we can have in depth. And I think there's many different types of hunting, and I think there's some that that I'm perfectly okay with, and pretty much all of the animal
Same.
rights people, yeah, are okay with. And then there's other forms of it where it's like, no, this really isn't right, and this isn't what hunting should be. Yeah,
Yeah,
but
same
like,
thing I think with animals as food, like, it's same thing with domesticates being utilized for food, same thing with research animals. I think that there's an extreme on one end, there's an extreme on the other. I'm not saying I fall in the middle almost ever, but I think that there's always a continuum of sort of human dominion, extractive, practices, utilizing things for our own, sort of, I don't know, gain, all the way to like deep and profound respect for the sacrifice that these organisms are making through no choice of their own and really having a lot of gratitude for it. I think there's always sort of a continuum there, right?
totally. And I think the conversation to have is, all right, so where does each one of us fall on that continuum? And then, how do we live out our lives with that? And um, it's so one of the things that I've been kind of turning over in my head a lot these days. So in the book, after we so in the first three chapters, I basically go on a walk through a typical Eastern suburban neighborhood, and I try to sort of map the latest in the science of animal intelligence onto all of the animals who are living there. And with that, so I'm just trying to get away from this feeling that I sometimes get when I read about animal intelligence, but it can kind of feel very abstracted and not like something that just surrounds us all the time. And so that's how the book starts out, and then it kind of goes from there to looking at the idea of personhood and what it means to be a person, and for an animal to be considered a person, and then on from there to some sort of new thinking that's going on in how some philosophers and theorists are thinking about animals. And there's been this, I'm not going to call it a big movement, but a movement in the last decade or so to get away from, not to get away, but to not only think about animals and animal rights, in terms of what is right or wrong at the individual level, but also to think about how we can try to, represent animals in human decision making and human institutions. And like, that might sound kind of ivory tower, but like one example of it would be that there's this huge and incredible cormorant colony in Toronto, and quite a few people there, maybe a decade or so ago, are like, well, they're killing trees where they roost, and like it's kind to me that's kind of ridiculous. Like the amount of trees being killed by these cormorants was like a tiny little fraction of the number of trees that get cut down for development every year. But when humans do it, hey, not such a big
Right.
deal. When cormorants do it, it's like, oh my God, won't somebody think about the trees? So whatever. But their values matter too, and their perspectives matter too. But the way that the city ultimately dealt with this was by putting together a committee of people to figure out what should be done. And you include some of the people who, are not happy with the cormorants, and you also include cormorant advocates and people who speak for them. And they just came up with this really smart plan to, basically establish the zones where cormorants could roost and encourage them, or some of them, to move out of the trees and onto the ground. And pretty much everybody wins, right? Like the cormorant colony is extraordinary and teeming. They're killing fewer trees. Everybody's perspectives are being represented. So, this principle of animal representation, can play out really in very practical ways. But anyways, the like as I've been thinking about, wow, like we're 3 months away from the presidential election, and the liberal democracy, I think it's fair to say, is really um, under siege in North America and much of the world. And like here I am talking about like how animals should be represented in our democracies too. And that can kind of, I think, maybe sound a little bit frivolous given the existential stakes of what's going on. But I also make peace with it by just saying, like, that doesn't mean that animals deserve representation any less. And it's still really important to think through what the principles at the foundation of our political systems are. And I think one of them is that all persons should be represented, and if that means animals as well, that's how it should be. And maybe in practical terms, that's not how it's going to be right away, but it's still a really valuable act of imagination. And now I've rambled on a
Yeah, I
lot,
mean,
and I
I
can't
wouldn't
remember
say
the
that it
yeah.
No. No, no, no. I wouldn't say that it sounds frivolous because I hear you. I hear that there's a concern that if somebody's like, literally there's human beings who are, in poverty. They're human beings who don't have housing security. And here you are like, fighting for the cormorants. Like I hear that sort of on its surface or when the resolution is high, that it can feel like, come on, get your priorities in order. But again, when you zoom out and you start to take a more cosmic perspective, uh the very principles and the very humanistic values that come into play when ensuring that somebody living in poverty or who doesn't have housing security is cared for by the systems in place are the exact same ones that care for the cormorants. It's like if we can't think in terms of empathy, if we can't think in terms of cooperation and we're always sort of pushing towards these very capitalistic Western um, uh, progress, extractive values, they hurt everybody. You know what I mean? It's like at that point, I don't see a huge difference. Um, and yeah, maybe that makes me sound out of touch, but I don't know. I think in some ways it's the opposite. Like it's the very same values that apply to people that apply to how we treat animals.
Oh, a hundred
I think it's
percent.
rare that somebody is yeah, like it's rare that somebody is like conscientious about their impact on the planet and then turns around and is like a sociopath towards other people. Like I don't think it always,
Mhm.
it doesn't work that way. It's like the opposite.
Totally. And like the people I know who are most passionate about animal issues are also equally passionate about human issues. And, there is also this very long tradition of thinkers and activists who have just made the argument that how, animals, the way that our relations to animals are a reflection of sort of how we think about people who are very, or from how we think about human beings who are very different from us. And there were so many, abolitionists who came out of the fight to end slavery and then turned their attentions to animals. And, um, I think, that argument is one that resonates with me. And I also think that it's just interesting to me how people who are like really passionate about animal issues or really passionate about environmental issues get called out for it, right? They're like, "Oh, why aren't you thinking about human beings?" But like if those people were taking all the time that they put into, environmental issues or animal issues and just spending it, binge watching television, nobody would criticize them, right? Like And
Exactly. Yeah. And
yeah,
also, by the way, they are thinking about human beings because all those things affect
mhm,
human beings.
totally.
But I
So,
think there is a very small but vocal, and I think it's probably a little bit less relevant kind of in 2024. Maybe it's not. I'm sort of thinking about like Reagan era, like punk rock sort of anarchist responses to a lot of really like restrictive, like at the beginning of this sort of big deregulation push, you did see a more, I hate to use the word, but like militant or like radical left movement, which was very sort of animal rights, like, break into the labs and like free the animals, or like exposure of factory farms, which some really good stuff came out of the movement. But there was, I think, I think it often gave some of this stuff a bad name because it felt almost so left wing that it became a bit right, like a little bit like we're going to take this into our own hands. And it almost didn't feel like there was a concern for the welfare of people. And I don't know if that was a backlash of like, because like I said, it was sort of within this anarchist mentality of the time of like animal liberation to the detriment of operating within human beings. And so I worry that sometimes that sort of caricature of animal rights activism has put a bad taste in people's mouths. And I think it affected me because I used to be an animal
mhm,
researcher and I never
mm,
used the word animal rights. I always
mhm.
used the word animal welfare for that reason, because I felt like there was an extreme even on the left that just wasn't reasonable, and it wasn't fully taking into account that you can, for example, utilize animals in research and still really give a shit about their welfare and really be grateful for the sacrifices being made. You know, when I used to teach basic biology at the university level, I would put the fear of like, Zeus into my students when I was like, these animals died so that you could learn.
Mhm.
Do not, denigrate them. Do not like play with their bodies. Don't make jokes about this. This is a serious endeavor. And the kids would not dare. They were like, okay. They would not dare to like pierce their ears or throw them around the room. Like you would hear horror stories of the way that these kids treated these animals, which, like, to me, I had to early and often reinforce the sanctity of that relationship because of the deep reverence that I had. At the same time, I think that there was a movement that was like an abolitionist movement that was like, under no circumstances is this necessary. And I was like, okay, then never take medicine again. Like it just felt so detached from reality to me.
Yeah, and I think those extremes do exist, but there are so many
Mhm.
people who are kind of, in not necessarily in the middle, but somewhere else along the spectrum. And so often
Yeah,
our
agree. Yeah, yeah.
conversations, yeah, like our conversations, people circle the wagons, or else the way that the conversations are described kind of falls back on those extreme tropes. And something
Yeah,
something
it's
I
like the
really.
the the hardcore vegans versus the factory farmers, but
Mhm.
like that's not. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
And there's a whole world of people in the middle. And something that, is really important to me with Meet the Neighbors is that ultimately, like, I'm not really telling people what they should do or how they should do it, but just saying, like, think these things through, have these conversations.
Right.
That's what matters.
I love that because I don't know, it comes back to me to like a very fundamental principle in clinical psychology, which is like kind of first comes insight, then comes action. Like, y- often people don't even have an opinion about these kinds of things because they haven't thought them through. And it's not uncommon. We think about political issues that are complicated. Um, uh, I hate to like evoke because I don't think it's that complicated, but you think about what's going on in Gaza. Or I remember being, I don't know, 25 years old, having grown up my whole life in Texas and then moving to the West Coast and being confronted with questions about capital punishment and really having to grapple. I have a very strong opinion in one direction now, but I didn't growing up because it's not what I was exposed to. And so when individuals are developing their political identities and when they're developing their values and their morals, they cannot really have an opinion. They cannot act until they have insight, and they can't develop insight until they're confronted with these things and they think about them deeply and reasonably, not in this, like you mentioned, caricatured way that's on one or another extreme. And so your book is really helping people confront with these things so that they can develop their own complex and meaningful points of view, their own morals, their own values that weren't handed to them, as dogma, but that they themselves are kind of evolving and developing based on knowledge, sometimes indigenous knowledge, sometimes Western scientific knowledge, but all of that knowledge together.
Hmm.
It's so important.
Totally. And like I think we're at this moment too where there's such an appetite for, like richer relationships with the living world. And, I think you see that in like the popularity of Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, sort of this idea that humans and nature shouldn't be kept separate. And like there's such a desire to feel connection and kinship. But what that connection and kinship kind of looks like in practice has yet to be defined. And I think that's kind of sort of where Meet the Neighbor shines a light. And actually, touching on something that you were just talking about, I want to ask you a question. So, um, a little while ago, I wrote an article about the idea of giving something back to animals used in research, as in exchange for what we derive from them. And so this for me was actually sparked by like receiving the COVID vaccine. And like, I was so grateful for that vaccine, and it did come out of animal testing. Um and it just occurred to me, I'm like, wow, like what did the animals get in return for this, right? Like we're getting so much from them. What did they get in exchange? And what would it mean for them to get something in exchange? And like I don't have answers to that either. It's just a question that I think is really interesting, and I wonder if it's something that you thought about.
I think it is, and I think it's important, and I think that there's sort of the larger philosophical grappling, and then there's the what it actually looks like in practice. Because I think one thing that a lot of people probably don't know is that a lot of different kinds of animals are used in very, very different ways, right? So the way that we utilize, let's say, um, primates in research is very different than the way that we might utilize mice in research or fruit flies in research. And, oftentimes we conflate, I think, we think about animal research and we think about like a laboratory class dissecting frogs, which is not what animal research is. That's teaching. And, we used to do laboratory exercises at the academic university level to teach students where we had wild caught bullfrogs and we would pith them and dissect them and look at their stomach contents. And this was a frog living its life in the wild. It was full of like crayfish. But then most of the research that I did was with mice, and those mice were bred in a facility. They were cloned, they were engineered, and they never would have existed if not for science. And that doesn't, I think, it doesn't, what's the word I'm looking for? Divorce us from responsibility because they were still alive regardless, right? We think of domesticates, farm animals that are often bred for the sole and express purpose of being utilized for food. If we freed them, they would die and then they would not, and then they would go extinct, right? Like if we didn't actually utilize them for that purpose. That doesn't mean they have a good life. It also doesn't mean that while they're alive for the express purpose of being bred for food for us, that they're not real. They still have, as you mentioned, minds. They still have emotions. They still experience the world. And so it's a complicated question, I think, when we're talking about the who of it and the what of it and the how of it. How do we give back? Are we giving back to conservation? Are we giving back to these animals that were expressly bred for these purposes? And what does that look like? I think one of the things that I always tried to do, and I didn't have much power because I was a student, was to think about how I was using these animals and to never waste under any circumstances, to always be so conscientious about waste. One of the things that I liked that my lab did is we were doing neuroscience research, and we would use a timed pregnant mouse and used the brain cells of the pups because they needed to be developmental. So one pregnant mouse could seed something like, I don't know, 50 experiments as opposed to one mouse, one experiment. And for me, that felt like a responsible way to do the work that I was doing. It wasn't always possible for a lot of other labs, but that felt responsible to me. Get as much utilization out of as little death as possible. But it's hard, and I couldn't do it that long. I sacrificed these mice by my own hand. I utilized their tissue. I did it for several years, and then I was done, and I didn't want to do it anymore. I learned a lot from it, but it was tough for me. For other people, that's not the case. I think it's a really personal experience. But if anything, just increasing human gratitude and reverence for the natural world and ensuring that as we engage with it, we do it responsibly, maybe is something we can give back to the animals.
Hmm.
Teaching our students that the way that they engage with nature has a massive ripple effect.
Hmm. I
Um,
I
I
agree
don't
with
know.
that,
It's a
and
tough one.
it is a tough one, and that question of like giving back, it also has been much on my mind. So like right now, I'm looking out at this beautiful forest and this beautiful field, and there's really this increasing awareness that the the world we live in is something that is created by life itself. All of the soil is decomposing matter that is aerated and enriched by countless insects and the groundhogs who are digging in it and the skunks who are regulating the prey populations and all the spiders and so on and so on and so on, right? Like all of this, like nature doesn't just spring into being. It's something that emerges through the interactions of countless creatures. And a question that I now find myself thinking about is, okay, what do I owe, or what would I like to give in return for all of that? And not just thinking about that question and that exchange sort of in very broad population level terms, but like, okay, what do I owe, the groundhog who now lives beneath my deck, in exchange for all that the animal kingdom has given me? And I think it's important to think about individuals too when we think about nature. And in the case of the groundhog and like all of these animals who kind of like so Meet the Neighbors, it's not a book just narrowly about urban nature, but urban nature figures prominently in it because that's sort of where so many of us kind of, that's where we live, that's where we encounter animals, that's where we develop our ethics of
And even if
nature.
we don't,
Mhm.
and even if we don't, whether we live in an urban center or not, even the most rural among us have an urban hub within their,
Yes.
even the farmer who lives
Mhm.
out among, they have urbanized their home. It's a fortress
Totally.
that sort of protects them from the elements.
Absolutely, yeah. And I don't want to like play into this like forgetting about just like looking at everything in terms of cities and forgetting everybody who doesn't live within them. And like I
Right.
should say here, like I live in,
But
so
most
like
people do live in cities, to be
uh,
fair.
but lots of them don't.
To
And
be
like
fair.
even
Most
even
people
me,
live in cities. Yeah.
like when I'm like, so Bangor, where I live, is like 35,000 people, and it's definitely a city to me. But like, so are like all of like the surrounding towns. Like when I think about what urban is, like it totally also means like that little village core of a place, where 400 people live or whatever. Or for that matter, yeah, like our truly rural backyards and these places that kind of like they don't really come in for attention from conservation. They're often not governed by state wildlife agencies, or if they are, like Maine Fish and Wildlife isn't paying much attention to my backyard. Um, and like these, there are these sorts of zones where like we make choices that really shape the lives of other animals, and we share these spaces, right? Like they're not like, this isn't like my space that an animal has come into, but it's a shared community. And yeah, that's just how I think of
Yeah.
them. And I keep
I
an eye
mean,
out for my groundhog.
I love that. And yeah, and I feel very lucky in some ways to have found a home in Los Angeles among a lot of really brilliant and beautiful, very science-minded and nature-minded individuals with the Natural History Museum here, the California Wildlife Federation, like these different groups that are so mindful of urban wildlife, of connectivity. Like we use that word a lot, right? Connectivity. So
Hmm.
how I have this home, right? I have a small lot home. So it takes up very little physical space. Like the lot of my house is smaller than the actual square footage of my house because it's built up. Yet still, it's very strange. Yeah. Yet still, and so in that, I do feel like, okay, I am already making a cooperative decision to take up as little space as possible and still have a protected, sheltered dwelling where I feel comfortable and I can blast my air conditioner, right? But at the same time, okay, my roof deck, what can I do? How can I invite the hummingbirds? How can I ensure that I have, the pollinators who are present? And, I look around the way that my development has planted these drip irrigation systems and has these wonderful like lemon trees with these bees, and it's not perfect, but there are so many people in Los Angeles that I see doing interesting things like urban beekeeping, who have certified wildlife habitats in their backyards, who don't have lawns. A lot of Los Angeles said, fuck the lawn. The lawn is bad, And so they were like, we're not doing that anymore. We're going to grow native plants, or we're going to have desert scaping, or whatever the case may be that doesn't use much water. I think about P22, our resident mountain lion who recently passed, who, was a sad but also inspirational, very talk about personhood. I mean, he had a Facebook page, very inspirational animal that rallied an entire city together to raise money to build a massive wildlife crossing in order to increase connectivity for these threatened cats, genetically threatened cats. And so, yeah, I think that urban centers, when those values are celebrated by institutions, it really does have a massive impact on the way that people think. Like when P22, kind of midway through his popularity, there was a you remember Bodie McBoatface. So there was a similar thing where it was like, let's do a poll to rename P22, right? And so it was like, and we expected that, like Catty McCat. But you know what won in the poll? The name that won was P22, because
Hmm.
people were like, that's his name, even though it just meant Puma
Uh-huh.
number 22, the 22nd collared Puma out of the Santa Monica mountains. That everybody knew him. And they were like, we love him as he is. And to me, that was such a great example of exactly what you're talking about. This urban, yeah, right? Like it's yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what else I can say about it except that like I feel very lucky to live in a place where it is such an urban center. I mean, LA is the second largest city in the country, right? And it's got it's like the eighth largest economy in the world or something like that. But at the same time, um, goodness, do we have a lot of wildlife and a lot of kind of connected spaces and a lot of just conscientious thought about how we
Hmm.
live with the insects, how we live with the apex predators, how we live with the what we think of as like the urban, like our coyotes and our skunks and our possum. I have a possum that lives in my development. He just hangs out on the wall all the time, and I always say hi to him when I walk by.
I love that. Do you have a
How can
name
we
for him?
ensure that their habit? Yeah, yeah. He's like our wall friend. Yeah.
Mm.
But yeah, how can we ensure that they're safe too? And remember, as silly as it is, remember like we built this house. When I see people on Nextdoor bitching about coyotes, like I love that all of the responses are, you built a house in their habitat. You best be letting them exist near you. It's the least you can do. The least you can do is not put rat poison out to cause mange.
Mhm.
The least you can do is not make decisions that make it harder for these animals to exist, that actively harm them. But what we should all be doing is swinging the pendulum in the other direction, and doing things that allow for, let's allow our yards to have these native plants and these low, bristly areas where animals can nest and they can, safely make babies for the next generation. Like, and food, native plants that feed them and provide shelter. It's not that hard. It's just a decision we have to make.
Totally. And it's really nice too, right? Like what we
Right,
get
because
out
then
of
you
it.
get to like watch
Yeah.
the animals in your
Mhm.
yard.
Right? Like you get to live in a more verdant
Ugh,
world, and there's all these animals around. It's a good way of being.
it so is. You strike me as somebody who has a wildlife, like a camera trap in your backyard, do you?
You know,
You do,
I
don't you?
at times I have, but I also feel a little ambivalent about intruding into the animals' lives that way. And like even
Oh,
if
right,
they
like
don't know,
watching them like you're like a creepy voyeur. Yeah,
it's a little
yeah.
strange. And I'm like, I put myself in their shoes and I'm like, how would I feel if like all of a sudden there's this like strange box near my home that lit up every time I came near it? And I'm just like,
Mhm,
you know what? Like, do
mhm.
I really need to see everything they do? But every now and then I will put it outside because I do want to see what they do.
And that's such an interesting I love that because as we've been talking about these decisions that we make that aren't so extreme. Like what a beautiful example. Like, yes, I put up a camera trap. Yes, I got to see the different species. Then I started to feel like I was being invading their territory, so I took it back away. I got to sample and observe and see what I'm working with and experience the joy from that. And then I said, at this point it's voyeuristic and it's not necessary. And I got the knowledge and the information. Now let's let them have their privacy. What a lovely balance. I love
Mhm.
that.
Thank you. And and like thinking about animals this way, like thinking about like, oh, what does it mean for animals to have privacy? What does it mean to think about the labor they do? I think like these are kind of the really interesting, nuanced questions that do ultimately come out of the science, because if we were talking about a bunch of
Mhm.
automatons who don't have, you know, a meaningful interior life and relations with each other, then none of this would matter, right? Well, who cares about their privacy? Who cares what we owe them in
Right.
return? But of course, like every animal is a
Well, and some people
someone.
might be thinking that already.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's the thing. Some people might be thinking that already, and I even had that, I have to admit, that sort of, first thought when you said, like, "Oh, I don't wanna invade their privacy," and I'm like, "They don't know." But then, of course, you were like, "There's this box, and it lights up every time and it's like, "Oh, yeah, they do know that." They may not understand that you're there watching them on film,
Mm-hmm.
they may not have that level of insight into what's going on, but they still understand that there's this piece of plastic on the tree that they used to rub up against, and it's interesting and weird and smells funny, and it's in we do what we can, we camouflage them, we try to hide them, but at the same time, like, there's a reason animals constantly walk up and have these like extreme, nose selfies on camera traps because they're looking at it. They're like, what is that
Mm-hmm.
thing?
And like I don't want to make it sound like I think like all camera traps are bad. And like I think like part of what is like so cool about them is that like so like camera traps, like anytime I go out and buy a trail camera, like they're always like super marketed, like like they're in camo and they're for people who are hunting. And like so many people are just
Yeah.
curious about the animals they share their communities with. And like that's a wonderful thing. And
Mhm.
like there was this really fun study that came out a few years ago now, where like the first documented use of tools in skunks was by a woman in her backyard in I think like
Mm. Oh, yeah.
Arizona or something, right? And like like she built a wildlife
Ah,
fountain, so all the animals had somewhere to drink, and she put a trail camera by it. And I should say that I feel like putting a camera on a fountain is a much better thing than putting a camera like next to a den or something like that. Um, and so
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
she recorded a skunk who was picking up rocks and using them to, to break holes in the ice that had formed on the water bowl overnight, and like, and it was just like this little picture of skunk life that otherwise nobody would have had. And it was so cool that this woman was able to get it through a trail camera and just by paying really close attention to the animals all around her. And this is sort of another thing that I think is interesting, where like at any moment there's hundreds of people studying baboons in Africa or whatever, right? Like we're super interested in non-human primates, and there's certain animals that we study all the time. And yet there's these very common everyday creatures like skunks or like groundhogs who live all around us. And really, like scientists don't pay all that much attention to them, at least not, there are not hundreds of ethologists and conservation biologists out there studying like, oh, what do skunks do all day long, and it's just some
Right.
regular everyday person who just observes them carefully and comes up and finds these or illuminates their lives in new ways, and I just really like that.
I love that so much. And I love the sort of recommendation, I don't know if I would call it that, but the insight that you have that like there are other kind of ways to do observation that feel less invasive to the organism. I think of uh like bird houses or bird baths that have built-in or
Mm-hmm.
feeders. We're starting to see more and more of those things marketed where it's like, a very high-tech camera. It's already built in. It streams to your computer so you can like watch your hummingbird feeder all day. Um, and the bird doesn't see it at all. They're just getting fed. And so it's not impacting their lives. So those kinds of things I think are really cool that we're seeing a movement into that, which celebrates existing within these natural spaces and inviting these animals and their rich lives into. It's not so much like inviting them into your home, it's inviting them, it's producing habitat for them that used to be there, that your home removed. So it's kind of reinstating some habitat in, I guess, in cooperation with your home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, including them in your world, like both physically and just also in in your awareness, right? And I think like it's a much richer sense of being in the world that you get out of thinking of the animals around you this way. And then I would say, and of course, you don't just take that, and it doesn't just end with your backyard, because really, like, we're everywhere, and we can think about animals in our backyards or in very wild and far away places just through the lens that they're somebody.
I completely agree. Yeah. Oh, there's so much. And what's so funny is we spent this whole hour almost talking about sort of the philosophy and the ethics and the meta conversations about sort of what your book is founded on without really digging deep into all of the examples. And that's okay because I have a feeling that most of your interviews will be example heavy.
Mm,
And also, people read the book, right? Like we're talking about the why of it out and why of it all. But the book is full of these rich and beautiful and inspiring examples of all of these things that we have been talking about, right?
it indeed it is. And yeah, so I'm still not comfortable promoting my book. So buy my book.
Well, do it. This is why you are here. So go ahead and do it.
I will never feel entirely comfortable pumping my own tires. Uh, but yeah, and love your groundhogs. That too.
Yes, if you've got them nearby. I guess most people in the US have groundhogs
All
nearby.
your
Is that
all,
where do
all your
groundhogs
burrowing
live?
rabbits. They're pretty widespread, if not
There you go.
groundhogs
Yeah,
and
exactly.
other burrowers.
Yeah, yeah. And there is a way to protect your garden and at the same time, invite these interesting creatures around and we can live harmoniously with a little bit of ingenuity, but the way to do that is not to make assumptions. It's to try to understand the inner worlds of these animals and understand why they do the things they do, how they do the things they do, so that we can then live more cooperatively with them. It's to meet the neighbors, damn it. It's very important. So everybody, what a great segue. Everybody, the book is Meet the Neighbors: Animal Minds and Life in a More Than Human World by Brandon Keim. Brandon, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed this.
Me too. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.